Hello, and welcome back to Radical Engagements, and we complete our series on the CPGB Provisional Committee debates with Chris Cutrone, with Large Parker intervening from about 10 years ago on the nature of Lukács. Wow, that's a lot. I'm finishing off with a speech that Chris Cutrone gave on a presentation in Chicago in January 11th, 2014. Almost exactly a decade ago at this point, that developed out of this debate the year before in 2013 that we have gone over. I remember being somewhat impressed by this, even though I'd recently left the Platypus Affiliated Society when this came out. So I wanted to cover it, even though in retrospect, I've found some of Chris's letters and some of people's responses to Chris's letters around these Lukács debates to be not wrong, but often I want more specificity from Chris, and I often think his interlocutors are just talking past him. The exception was the Chris and Lawrence Parker exchange, although Parker didn't respond to Chris, so, or at least not where I've seen. And so I don't know what to say on that. And specifically, I thought Lawrence Parker's defense of Lukács was fairly nuanced. I think some of Cutrone's responses are also solid. Some of them are not. I think, again, Chris has a tendency to make big, bold statements with confidence and back them up, kind of. Sometimes if you really pin them down, there actually is a lot of thought going behind them. This is not to say that there's any hucksterism or misrepresentation going on. I don't think that at all. What I do think is that sometimes you have to push Chris to get him to fully explain exactly what he means, and other times he'll just repeat himself with pithy responses. I think it's useful to use him as an interlocutor, whether you agree with him or not, because he does require some serious responses on these theoretical and philosophical issues. On immediate politics, those are more debate, and Chris's positions often are more nuanced than he states, but he states them in bombastic ways. I never particularly understand this approach. It's not mine. If I'm bombastic, I tend to be not trying to downplay my position when asked for the questions about it. So it's a Chris tactic thing. You get used to it. Anyway, back to the article at hand with all this going on in the beginning here. I think this is, I remember this being a good article. That said, I haven't read it since I did a show about it and Mike McNair with Douglas Lane in 2020. So it's been a few years since I've approached this text. I'd say about 4. All right, so let's get into it. Why still read Lukács, The Place of Philosophical Questions of Marxism by Chris Cutrone? This is from Platypus Review, issue 62. Came out in February 2014. Was based on a presentation that Chris gave on a plenarium on Lukács in Chicago and the prior month in January 11th, 2014. And it's a response to the debates between them and the CPGB Provisional Committee and the Weekly Worker that we've already covered. All right. The role of critical theory. Why read George Lukács today, especially since his most famous work, History and Class Consciousness, is so clearly an expression of a specific historical moment? It is. That's a good point. The aborted world revolution of 1917 to 1919, in which he participated. I would add to that also the concretation of the Bolshevik Party from 1918 to 1921, which is McNair's assertion. Attempted to follow Vladimir Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg. Are there philosophical lessons to be learned? Are principles to be gleaned from Lukács' work? Or is there rather the danger, as the Communist Party of Great Britain's Mike McNair puts it, of theoretical overkill, stymieing of political possibilities, closing up the struggle for socialism and tiny authoritarian and politically sterile sects founded on theoretical agreement. Mike McNair's article, Lukács' Philosophy Crop, argues about the issue of the relation between theory and practice in the history of ostensible Leninism, taking issue particularly with Lukács' book History and Class Consciousness, 1923, and Lenin, 1924, as well as Karl Kirsch's 1923 essay, Marxism and Philosophy. The issue is what kind of theoretical generalizations of consciousness could be derived from the experience of Bolshevism from 1903 to 1921. I agree with McNair that the philosophical agreement is not the proper basis for political agreement. Yeah, Cutrone's actually pretty consistent on this. But this is not the same as saying that political agreement has no theoretical implications. I have discussed previously in the philosophy of history and defending Marxist Hegelianism against Marxist critique, as well as in Gillian Rose's Hegelian critique of Marxism. The issue is whether the theoretical positions have necessary political implications. I think it is a truism to say that there's no sure theoretical basis for effective political practice. That's true enough. But McNair seems to be saying nothing more than this. And subordinating theory to practice, McNair loses sight of the potential critical role theory can play in political practice, specifically the task of consciousness of the history and the struggle of transforming society in an emancipatory direction. Now, I'm not sure McNair does that, but I do think McNair maybe overclaims here in his piece, as I talked about when I read it, over-attributing the specific problems of the common terms positions in 1920 and 1921 being generalized forever, and that works its way into Lukács. I don't think that's an ultra-left position. McNair does. Nonetheless, I do think that there's something to that. But I also see that you can read McNair as overcorrecting, and I think this is something that Cutrone is trying to intervene against. A certain relation of theory to practice is a matter specific to the modern era. A certain, again, I wish we were more specific, but this continues. And moreover, a problem specific to the era of capitalism, that is, after the Industrial Revolution, a point that Chris harps on a lot. This is one of our big differences, is I think capitalism comes with agrarian capital. The ownership and trading of land and reinvestment of land predates the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution brings that ability to collect capital in that way and sell it as capital, not just as forms of rents, to industrial machinery. But it was already latent in agrarian capitalism, which is why agrarian capitalism really does kind of begin in England and in France, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's already showing a decline in the two forms of, quote, feudal relations, seigneury, which is relation by blood, and feudal, which is relation by oath, and the various legal codes that were hacked together out of remnants of prior legal codes from the Roman Empire to hold it all together in Europe. We can get into both seigneury and manorialism somewhere else, and the work of Chris Wickham is helpful here. But agrarian capital already moves away from that. It's the use of free labor and not serfs, and reinvestment into the product of labor, i.e. better ways of tilling the land, that leads to capital and the kind of industrial techniques that we use for capital commodity breaking. That's not unique to the Industrial Revolution, and that periodization that Chris offers over and over and over again, I actually don't see explicitly stated in Marx. It is explicitly stated in English's Communist Catechism, but it's revised away in the manifesto as the specific instance of the problem. The existence of fixed capital in the forms of machines, not just in the forms of land, is not what makes capitalism in and of itself. But Chris insists on this, I think, to insist that bourgeois society did not have to be capitalistic, and thus saying that communism is a fulfillment of bourgeois society, which is somewhat unique to platypus affiliated society. He will say it's a Marx. I've read the Marx. We've debated it already. If he wants to come on my show and talk about it, we'll talk about it. Is not entirely the same thing. I will say, though, that there's a relationship to Bonapartism as a form of capital maintaining order with the various classes in collaboration, and its manifestation in expansionary imperialism is pretty clearly synonymous in the work of other platypus. Spencer Leonard does actually do a good job of tracing these lineages, particularly in the journalism of Karl Marx, with an excellent explanatory essay. Which is to say, I'm just taking issue here because Chris is inserting something particular to platypus doctrine. It needs to be called out. Not because it's necessarily wrong, although I disagree with it. It's just it has subtle implications that need to be teased apart. You always have to do these with these things. Anyway, back to text. The emergence of the modern proletarianized working class in a struggle for socialism, and the crisis of bourgeois social relations, and thus the consciousness of society involved in the process. Critical theory recognizes the role of theory in the attempt to transform society is not to justify or legitimate or provide normative sanction, not to rationalize what is happening anyway, but rather to critique, to explore the conditions of possibility for change. Yes. I think that's fair. I think Chris is right here. The role of the critical theory is not to describe how things are, but rather how they might become, or how things could and should be, but are not yet. The political distinction then would not be over the description of reality, but rather the question of what can and should be changed, and over direction of that change. Hence, critical theory, as such, goes beyond the distinction of analysis from description. It does. It does deal with both descriptions and norms. It's not just normative. It is not just descriptive. The issue here is not theoretical analysis proper to practical matters, but beyond that, the issue of transforming practices with the active agency and subjective recognition, as opposed to merely experiencing change, is something that has already happened, aka the way most of us experience it. Capitalism itself is a transformative practice. Yes. See Schumpeter, see Marx, see everybody. But that transformation has eluded consciousness, specifically regarding the ways change has happened and the political judgments about this. All right. Go into more detail here. This is the specific role of theory. I guess that's the detail. And hence the place of theoretical issues or philosophical concerns in Marxism. Marxist critical theory cannot be compared to other forms of theory. Theoria, contemplation. I'm adding that, not Chris, but I get what he's getting at. Because they are not concerned with changing the world, generally, and the politics of our changing practices. That's the more unique part. Lukács distinguishes Marxism from contemplated or reified consciousness, contemplative being theoria normally means, and Aristotle, a reified consciousness to which bourgeois society had otherwise succumbed, and capitalism, or maybe bourgeois society succumbed in general. After all, Marxism used the term capitalism very much. Like, at all. If ostensibly Marxist tendencies, such as those of the followers of Tony Cliff, have botched theory, which they undoubtedly have, oh yeah, it is because they have conflated or rendered indistinct the role of critical theory as opposed to political exegesis of propaganda. Well, a lot of people confuse this, and I think maybe Lukács does too. But anyway, not always here, though. For organizations dedicated to propaganda, there must be an agreement as to such propaganda. The question is the role of theory in such propaganda activity. If theory is debased to justifying propaganda, then its critical role is evacuated. Yep, can be critical if you're just doing prop. Adjunct prop. And indeed, it can mask opportunism. Almost always does. I wouldn't just say it can. Will mask opportunism. But then it ceases to be proper theory. I mean, that's a Notries-Kautzmann fallacy, but whatever. I think this is still fair. Not simply wrong or falsified, but rather ideological, which is a different matter. Well, what is the matter? This is what happened, according to Lukács and Cohost, in the Second International Socialist International, resulting in the vulgarization of Marxism and the confusion of the formulations of political propaganda instead of properly Marxist critical theorization. Proletarian socialism. The proletariat was Marxist neologism for the condition of the post-industrial revolutionary working class, which is analogous metaphorically to the ancient Roman Republic's class of proletarians. Yes. Neologism or reappropriation of proletarians. I don't know. Proletariat. I guess it's a neologism because of the ending. The modern industrial working class was composed of citizens without property. if they were even citizens in most cases. And in modern bourgeois society, for instance, the view of John Locke, property and its objects is derived from labor, which is the first property. Sometimes. Hence, to be a laborer without property is a self-contradiction in a specific sense, in the sense that the expropriation of labor in capitalism happens as a function of society. In modern free wage labor is supposed to be a contractual agent with full rights of ownership and disposal of her own labor in exchange. It's buying and selling as property, as a commodity. Sure, yes. This is the most elementary form of right in bourgeois society, from which others claim, for instance, individual right to be one's own person and equality before the law flow. If, according to Marx and Engels, the condition of modern post-industrial revolution working class or proletarian expressed a self-contradiction of bourgeois social relations, this was because the set of social relations, our bourgeois right, was in need of transformation. Agreed, although we need to be more specific here. The Industrial Revolution indicated a potential convention beyond bourgeois society. Yes, further socialization of labor mediated through fixed capital, aka machines, which are socially produced and create more development of productive forces, as well as other benefits. They also have cost. We'll get to that later. Though maybe not in this essay. If the workers were expropriated, according to Marx and Engels, this is because of a problem of the value of labor of the greater social societal level, not at the level of the individual capitalist firm, not reducible to the contractual relations of employees to her employer, which remain fair exchange. Yeah, this is good Marx exegesis. Still on board with Cutrone here. The wage contract was still bourgeois, but the value of the labor exchange was undermined by the greater global society, which was no longer simply bourgeois, but rather industrial, that is, capitalist. That's not a distinction Marx makes, and I've said this over and over again, and I go back to the key forms. Marx does not distinguish capitalism from bourgeois society. Capital is a product of bourgeois society. Capitalism, thus, is a result of bourgeois society. It may not have been the only form. The other forms were like the enlightened despotism of in France, for example, which was still pretty capitalistic, but one controlled by the state and closer to other non-capitalist societies that were not feudal nor capitalist. But there's not a lot of evidence that bourgeois society would go that way. Bourgeois society is based on a, quote, middle class becoming the ruling class, that middle class being merchants, burgers, so they say. Anyway, I think this is still mostly right. I'm just saying I'm seeing this subtle distinction that Chris is making a lot of that I don't see in Marx. I just don't see it. And I've read a shit ton of Marx, and I've read a shit ton of Marx in response to Chris, specifically the things that he likes to cite. But anyway, this is a side note. This is just a debate that we've already had. All right. The struggle for socialism by the proletariat was an attempt to reappropriate the social property of labor that had been transformed and expropriated or alienated in the Industrial Revolution. Agrarian labor isn't fundamentally different than the Industrial Revolution, so expropriated and alienated is not unique to it. But otherwise, I'm with you. You should just say capitalism. I see what you're doing here. I know what you're onto. I know this distinction matters a lot to you. It's a distinction that I think is important, that the scale and mode of production is fully subsumed in the Industrial Revolution, but it's already there in agrarian capitalism with the end of feudal relations and the beginning of the yeoman state. Otherwise, we couldn't argue that the United States was a bourgeois and thus capitalist society, which it was. Although, I guess, again, Chris would say that we should make a distinction between bourgeois and capitalism. The distinction Marx doesn't make because Marx hardly ever talks about capitalism as such. That's used more by later writers, although it was contemporaneously coined by him. It's translated in English that way, but a lot of times what you're looking at is bourgeois society proper. Anyway. Marx and Engels thought this could be achieved only beyond capitalism, for instance, the value of accumulated past labor in science and technology, which Marx called the general social intellect. Yeah. This is true, though. An objective condition was expressed subjectively, but the objective conditions of society were self-contradictory, and so expressed in self-contradictory forms of political subjectivity. Proletarian socialism. For Marx and Engels, the greatest exemplar of this self-contradictory form of politics was a transformed society was Chartism in Britain. I don't even think that Magnet would disagree with that. A movement of the high moment of the Industrial Revolution and its crisis in the 1830s and 40s, whose most pointed political expression was, indicatively, universal suffrage. The crisis of the bust period of the Hungry 40s indicated the maturation of bourgeois society. In crisis, as the preceding boom era of the 1830s already had raised expectations of socialism politically as well as technically and culturally, for instance, and the utopian socialism of Fourier, Saint-Simon, Owen et al., as well as in the young Hegelians, Bauer and such. The movement taking place around the world in the 1830s, on whose scene the young Marx and Engels arrived belatedly during its crisis and dissolution in the 1840s, aka when they all got into higher biblical criticism and walked away from a lot of the social stuff. All right. One must distinguish between the relation of theory and practice in revolutionary bourgeois era and the post-industrial revolution era of crisis of bourgeois society and capitalism and the proletarian struggle for socialism. If in bourgeois era there were productive tensions, a reflective speculative philosophical relation, for instance, for Kant and Hegel, between theory and practice, in the area of the crisis of bourgeois society, there's rather a negative or critical relation, hence the need for Marxism. Okay, other than that minor quibble that I'm not letting go of, I'm in agreement with this explication of the meaning of Marxism. I think this is basic but important. All right. As Frankfurt School Marxist critical theorist Theodor Adorno put it, the separation of theory and practice was emancipatory. It expressed the freedom to think at variance with the prevailing social practices unknown in ancient or medieval world traditional civilizations. Not unknown, actually, but not known at any mass scale. The freedom to think at variance of prevailing social practices was usually the province of monks and people who were given some amount of freedom for their administrative functions, which they had to justify. So I think this is a slight overexpression, but it's still mostly true. The freedom to relate and to articulate theory and practice was a hallmark of the revolutionary emergence of bourgeois society. Yeah, true. The combined revolution in the society of politics, economics, culture, religion, technique, and philosophy, the latter under the rubric Enlightenment. By contrast, the romantic socialism of the 19th century sought to reunify theory and practice, to make them one thing as they had been under the religious cosmology as the total way of life. If, according to Adorno, Marxism as opposed to romantic socialism did not aspire to unity of theory and practice in terms of their identity, but rather of their articulated separation and the transformation of society, transformation of both consciousness and social being, then what Adorno recognized was that, as he put it, the relationship of theory and practice is not established once and for all, but rather fluctuates historically. Yes. Still in agreement with Cutrone here. I think this is pretty good explications of the implications of critical theory as understood by Adorno and Marx, and why that at least most of Adorno's stuff is Marxist. We can go on and debate about the latter period. That's beyond the scope of the day. Marxism, though a different phase of its history, itself expresses function, but the function was an expression of a crisis in Marxism, and it's ultimately its failure. Adorno called it a negative dialectic. I mean, we know that a lot of Marxism failed, but I would like to go more into what the specific crises are. Anyway, I mean, Chris does elsewhere, but I'm always wanting more from this stuff. It expressed and was taken by the failure of the revolution, but this failure was not merely the failure of the industrial working class's struggle for socialism in the early 20th century, but rather the failure was the failure of the emancipation of the bourgeois revolution. This failure consumed history, undermining the past achievements of freedom. As Adorno's colleague Walter Benjamin put it, even the dead are not safe. Historical Marxism is not a safe legacy, but suffers the vicissitudes of the present. Yes. Yes, it really fucking does. Maddeningly so, I would add. But anyway, if we're still reading Lukács, we need to recognize the danger to which his thought, as part of Marxist history, is subject in the present. One way of protecting historical Marxism's legacy would be through recognizing the inapplicability in the present, distancing it from immediate enlistment in present concerns, which would concede too much already, undermining, liquidated without redeeming consciousness once already achieved. Okay, so this first section I'm on board with Chris on. I hadn't said much about Lukács's basic explanation of Marxism, but how we get there. This is the how. The division of Marxism. The title of Lukács's book, History and Class Consciousness, should be properly understood directly as indicating that Lukács's studies, the various essays collected in the book, were about class consciousness as a consciousness of history. Now, I would love to know more what that means, but I agree. That is the implication. This goes back to the early Marx and Engels, who understood the emergence of the modern proletariat and the struggles for socialism after the Industrial Revolution in a Hegelian manner. That is, as a phenomenon of forms of appearance of society and history specific to the 19th century. Yeah, although it was inverting the Hegelian matter, arguing that 19th century stuff emerged in a specific material context, but again, that's not disagreeing with Cutrone here, that's just nuancing it a bit. Moreover, Marx and Engels in their point of departure for Marxism, as opposed to other varieties of Hegelianism and socialism, look forward to the dialectical Aufhebung of the new modern proletariat, its simultaneous and self-fulfillment and completion, self-negation and self-transcendence in socialism would be also that of capitalism. In other words, Marx and Engels regarded the proletariat and struggle for socialism as the central key phenomenon of capitalism, yes, but the symptomatic expression of its crisis, self-contradiction, and need for self-overcoming. Yes. As Hegelians, Marx and Engels regard, I wouldn't say as Hegelians strictly, given how much Marx writes about his problems with Hegel, but he does follow a Hegelian methodology, and that can't be dropped. Marx and Engels regarded the contradiction as the appearance of the necessity and possibility for change. So the question becomes, what is the meaning of self-contradiction in bourgeois society? Self-contradiction of bourgeois social relations expressed by post-industrial revolution working class and its form of political struggle. Whew. Marx and Engels regarded the politics of proletarian socialism as a form of bourgeois politics in crisis and self-contradiction. Maybe. This is an assertion that I'm not willing to totally grant, but I'm not willing to say is wrong. There's something striking about it, which I think hits the Cutrone's assertion of its importance. It makes us uncomfortable. But there's something unfulfilled about what the specific nature of crisis and self-contradiction was and how it shifts in time. You can do a lot with this dishonest. I'm not saying that Chris is. In fact, I don't think he is, but I know other people who use this dishonestly. You can't hold someone who points out the distinction, though, accountable for everyone who weaponizes it. And I'm not going to do that to Chris here. All right. This is what it's meant for Marx and Engels to say the objective existence of the proletariat and subjective struggle for socialism were phenomena of the self-contradiction of bourgeois society and a potential Aufhebung. Yes. But the struggle for socialism was self-contradictory. That is what Lukács ruminated on in History and Class Consciousness. Well, give me a quote that proves that. Always asking for the proof in the text of these assertions. And I get them in the comments. So if Chris comments, go read the comments because they'll probably clarify this. But they might not. I went through his last comments and was like, I see a lot of what you're saying. I don't see how it relates to your points about Trump. And even when I do agree with you about the lawfare parts of all this madness, I don't see how I come to the conclusion that he does around the nature of the executive. But nonetheless, but this was not original to Lukács or achieved by Lukács' reading of Marx and Engels, but rather mediated through the politics of Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg. Lenin and Luxemburg provided access for Lukács as well as others of the nascent Third or Communist International to the original Marxism of Marx and Engels. All right, this is an ideal argument. I mean, original Marxism, Marx and Engels is in quotations here, and related to and developed from equals is a common Chris Cutrone argumentation tactic. Develop from equals is. We see this throughout Chris's argumentation style. For Marx and Engels recognized that socialism was inevitably ideological, a self-contradictory form of politics of consciousness. The question was how to advance the contradiction. Now, again, I mostly agree with this, other than access to the original Marxism of Marx and Engels, because I don't know how individuals magically grant you access to a different time period, given the own arguments made here. It's not entirely consistent with the we can't understand X, but nonetheless, the special pleading aside, I mostly agree with this as an explication of socialism. Socialism does emerge from self-contradictory earns. It both wants to empower the working class, aka the dictatorship of the proletariat, and abolish it by its universalization, thus enabling the promises of bourgeois rights to be fully fulfilled, because while they emerge from property, property is also their greatest limitation, particularly once that property takes the form not of personal property, which is what all the libertarians fret over, but capital, the ability to reproduce property in society itself. So my queasiness on specific assertions and my wish for more evidence, which I'm always asking for, still does not undermine that as a broad overview of what is at stake in Marxism. I think Chris is right. So you can quote me on that. As a participant in the projects of Communist International, for Lukács, his books, History and Class Consciousness and Lenin, as well as for Karl Korsch, Marxism and Philosophy, and other writings circa 1923, the intervening Marxism of the second, our Socialist International, become an obstacle to Marx and Engels' Marxism, and thus to the proletarian socialist revolution in the early 20th century. Yeah, but why? I mean, I think that the specific reason is why had it become? And it's not just the theory. An obstacle that the political struggles of Lenin, Luxemburg, and other radicals in the Second International sought to overcome. Agreed, but again, what variants are we looking at? The obstacle of the Second International Marxism had a theoretical as well as practical political aspects. It expressed both the level of theoretical consciousness as well as the level of political organization. Okay, this is true, but once again, it is so broad as to be a truism. What is true, but as truism, is not always particularly enlightening, except in the vaguest sense of like a very broad doodle of the world does give you some indication that there are continents and shit. So again, agreed, but not sure that that says as much as Chris seems to think it does. Second International Marxism had become an obstacle, according to Luxemburg Reform of Revolution. Finally, thank you. And in Lenin's What Is to Be Done, the latter of which attempted to application of the revisionist dispute, and the Second International to conditions of the Russian movement. The developments of the proletarian socialism in the Second International have produced its own obstacles, so to speak, in becoming self-divided between Orthodox Marxists who retain fidelity to the revolutionary politics of proletarian socialism in terms of the Revolution of 1848 and the Paris Commune of 1871, and the revisionists who thought political practice and theoretical consciousness of Marxism demanded transformation under the altered historical social conditions which have been achieved by the workers' struggle for socialism, which proceeded in an evolutionary way. Edward Bernstein gave the clearest expression of this revisionist view, which was influenced by the apparent success of the British Fabianism that had led to the contemporary formulation of the Labour Party and found its greatest political support amongst the working class trade union leaders in the Second International, especially in Germany, aka the Lassallians, our favorite bête noire. In Bernstein's view, capitalism was evolving into socialism through the political gains of the workers, a la Joseph Schumpeter's fears about democracy leading to socialism himself. You should read Schumpeter about that. A lot of people read Schumpeter as an outline without realizing he was an Austrian critic of Marxism, even though he was also very influenced by Marxism through his interrelations with the Marxian parts of the German historical school. A whole different debate here. Back to the case of Lukács, the Marxism of the Third International. Okay. Lenin, Luxemburg, and Lukács, and Korsch, amongst others following them, thought that the self-contradictory nature and character, origin, expression of proletarian socialism meant that the latter's development proceeded in a self-contradictory way, which meant the movement of historical progress was self-contradictory. I mean, other than the number of repeating phrases in that, I would think that it's right, although the specific nature of the self-contradiction needs to be teased out more. Always. Luxemburg summarized this review in Reform Revolution, where she pointed out that the growth in the organization and conscience of the proletariat was the self-part of, a new phenomenon of, the self-contradiction of capitalism, and so expressed itself in its own self-contradictory way. Yeah. The proletarian movement is part of the capitalist totality, and as long as it's under capitalist auspices, has similar self-contradictions. Chris is right about this. This is also obvious to me. It's been obvious to me since even before I was in the Platypus Affiliated Society. Which is why I think vulgar workerism and vulgar partyism is not sufficient for jack and shit. But nonetheless, here we are. Still mostly good. I'm definitely on the. I agree with like 90% of this, and what I disagree with, it's so striking because I agree with so much of this so far that I'm like, when my suspicions tend to be. Let's clarify what these specific self-contradictions are, where they're manifesting, etc. We're speaking in such broad ways, it's not always clear what exactly is at stake. And sometimes Chris gets to it in the next paragraph. So, it's just patience here. This was how Luxemburg graphs the revisionist dispute in Marxism of the Second International itself. The self-contradiction was theoretical as well as practical. For Luxemburg and for Lenin, the theoretical struggle was an expression of practical self-contradiction. Leon Trotsky expressed this orthodox Marxist view said by Lenin and Luxemburg in the 1906 pamphlet, Results and Prospects, on the 1905 revolution in Russia, pointing out that various prerequisites for socialism were self-contradictory. They were retarded rather than promoted each other. This view was due to the understanding that proletarian socialism was bound up in the crisis of capitalism, which was degenerative, or disintegrative, excuse me. Though it's similar. The struggle for socialism was caught up in the disintegration of bourgeois society in capitalism. Gonna need you to justify that, Chris. How is bourgeois society disintegrated into capitalism and not, manifested by capitalism? You really want to say bourgeois society from the charge of it being capitalist. Anyway, for Luxemburg, Lenin, and Trotsky, contra Bernstein, the crisis of capitalism was deepening. Correct. And they were right, I think. And it's still deepening to this very day. All right. Anyway, one of the clearest expressions of this integrative process of self-contradiction in Luxemburg, Lenin, and Trotsky's time was the relation of capitalism as a global system to the political divisions between nation states in the era of monopoly, capital, and imperialism that led to the World War. This was already apprehended in the revisionist dispute at the turn of the 20th century as expressing the need for socialism, the need for proletarian political revolution. Lenin and Luxemburg's academic dissertatorial dissertations of the 1890s on the development of capitalism in Russia and Poland, respectively, addressed this phenomenon of combined and uneven development in the epoch of capitalist crisis, degeneration, and decay, as expressed the need for world revolution. Moreover, Lenin and What Is to Be Done expressed a perspective that the revisionist dispute of Marxism was itself an expression of the crisis of capitalism manifesting within the socialist workers' movement, a prelude to revolution. Yes, I agree with this. No notes. All right. While it was conventional to oppose Luxemburg and Lenin's revolutionary socialism to Bernstein a la evolutionism, and hence oppose Luxemburg and Lenin's dialectical Marxism to revisionist mechanical one, what is lost in this view is the role of the historical dynamics of consciousness in Lenin and Luxemburg and Trotsky's view. Got to throw Trotsky in there. This phenomenon is a historical regression as opposed to progress, which the evolutionary socialism of Bernstein et al. Assumed, and later Stalinism also assumed. AKA Whiggish history. Whiggish history is bad. All right. I agree with Chris here. A lot. The most important distinction of Luxemburg and Lenin, as well as Trotsky's orthodox perspective and Lukács and Korsa's view, was what made their Marxism dialectical and Hegelian was its recognition of the historical regression. They don't say that, though. Give me a quote that says that. This is one of those assertions that I think, even if it's true, and I think it might be true, I want more proof. I don't just trust someone because they fucking say it. Anyway. Its regression of bourgeois society as degenerative, self-destructive crisis of capitalism. The process of degeneration was recognized as affecting the proletariat as politics as well. Benjamin and Adorno's theory of regression begins here. A bunch of theories come up here. Decadence, which is what I like, because regression implies a clean theological. Anyway, there's a lot here. Historical regression. The question is how to recognize on political practice of war theory the way in which the struggle for proletarian socialism achieved by the way of political action, the wage laborers in the post-industrial revolution era as such, is caught up as participates in the process of capitalist disintegration. The expression of proletarian socialism as a phenomenon of history, specifically as a phenomenon of crisis and regression. The history has multiple registers. Here is the principal register of the post-industrial revolutionary crisis of bourgeois society and capitalism, as crisis and departure from the preceding bourgeois social relations, those of the prior pre-industrial eras of cooperation and manufacture in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, a Marxist term. But also the register of the dynamics and periods within capitalism itself. Capitalism was for Marx and Engels already a regression of bourgeois society. That distinction is not there. But it's implied in the Bonapartist distinction, so I'll grant it. Was it a regression of bourgeois society or its natural consequences? Was it a regression of the aspirations of bourgeois society? Was bourgeois society ever going to be any other way? I mean, this is weird normative talk. This is where Lukács and Course's perspective, derived from Luxemburg's and Lenin's and Trotsky's view from 1900 to 1919, gotta love how he's got to add Trotsky in there, was considered an era of revolution, which might become problematic for us. Today, the history of the post-1923 world has not been as 1848 and 1914 was in the Second International Orthodox Radical Marxist, as opposed to revisionist view, a process of increasing crisis and development of revolutionary political necessities, but whether a process of continued social disintegration of capitalism without, however, being expressed in and through the struggle for proletarian socialism. Okay. I'm going to grant all that, even though I have hesitations in some of the language used. We'll just accept it for the moment. The reason why I have hesitations, I'm not sure that we can say that Lenin and Luxemburg and Trotsky all had the same views of regression and that they were clearly Marx and Engels' views. Partly because the distinction between bourgeois society and capitalism is a distinction that, again, Marx is usually blaming bourgeois society for what we call capitalism, not positing it in a pristine form of which capitalism is corrupting. He does recognize that the rights and promises of bourgeois society are amazing in a lot of ways, and a definite step in the advance over, like, say, manorial or seigneury or any of the other forms of feudal relations. But I'm not sure that I completely agree that we can completely call these the same thing. All right. Here's where the problematic of Tony Cliff's political project to Lukács and Course and his Lenin, Luxemburg, Trotsky may be located. In Cliff's perspective of his post-1945 time being non-revolutionary one, demanding a project of propaganda that is related but differs specifically from the movement of Lenin at all. For Cliffites and their organizations, political practice is one of propaganda in a non-revolutionary period, which is political action is less directly a practical, but rather an exemplary propaganda significance. This has been muddled by their strategy of movement building. Yes. Fair. Back on board with you, Chris. This was not the case for Luxemburg, Lenin, and Trotsky, whose political practice was likely about a struggle for power, and in whose practical project, Lukács and Course, theoretical work sought to participate, offering attempts at clarification and self-understanding to revolutionaries on the march. Cliff and his followers, at least their most self-conscious, have been known that they were doing something essentially different from Lenin at all. They were not organizing a revolutionary political party seeking to bid for power as part of an upsurge of the working class struggle in the context of a global movement, Second International, as has been the case for Lenin in the time was wanted to be done in 1902, are Luxemburg's mass strike pamphlet and Trotsky's revolution in Russia of 1905. Yet Cliffites had used the ideas of Lenin and Luxemburg and their followers, such as Lukács and Course, as well as Trotsky, to justify their practices. Yes. Okay, I'm back on board with Chris. This presents certain problems. Yes, Lenin et al. Could become ideological in the hands of the Cliffites, among any group, picking on the Cliffites because they were the most annoying 10 years ago, amongst others, and Leninism for Stalinists most prominently. So the question turns to the status of Lenin's ideas in themselves and in their own movement. Mike McNair points out that Lukács and Course work circa 1923 emphasized attack and so sought to provide a theory of the offensive, as opposed to Lenin's arguments about the necessities of retreat in 1920. as an against a critique of left-wing communism, and what McNair has elsewhere described as the need for Kautsky's patience and politically building for the proletarian socialism, as in the era of the Second International, 1889 to 1914. And so this limits the perspective of Lukács and Kortz after Lenin, Luxemburg, and Trotsky to a period of civil war circa 1905, 1914, 1917, and 1920, 2021. And this, McNair is concerned rightly with the theory becoming a blinder to proper political practice. Theoretical overture is a matter of over-philosophizing politics. Yes. There's a difference between active campaigning and the struggle for power, whether an attack or temporary retreat, and propagandizing, to which Marxism at best has been relegated to since the early 20th century. Yes. Also, opportunistically attaching itself to other national liberation movements is the other thing it's done. Anyway, however, in raising, by contrast, the need for conscious openness to empirical reality of political experience, McNair succumbs to the linear progressive view of history as well as a political practice. I don't know that he does. I'm not sure that's true. Turning into a manner of lessons learned, it becomes a quantitative rather than qualitative manner. Well, the quantitative turns into the qualitative and vice versa. Cough. Cough, 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 cough. Moreover, it becomes a theory of conventional rather than Marxist critical sense in which a description of reality and its analysis approach more and more adequate approximations. Lenin, Luxemburg, and Trotsky, and so Lukács and Kortz. I don't love his theory, his like naming lineages as if they're the same thing. This is something that I'm not loved when academics do, and I don't love it when Chris Cutrone does it. It always strikes me as suspicious because Kortz and Lukács are deeply opposed in many ways by 1924, even though they're both influential in the Frankfurt School. As orthodox as opposed to revisionist Marxists concerned with the development of consciousness, both theoretical and practically oriented rather than differently, and then what that a necessary transformation of Marxism, which took place in a particular guise, a return to the original Marxism of Marx and Engels, course, could be an asset to the present. But the present was the crisis of Marxism, 1914 to 1919, which is not today our moment. As even Cliff and his followers, with their notion of propaganda and non-revolutionary area, have recognized, as did Lukács and Kortz, in subsequent abandoning their circa 1923 perspectives. So, what is the status of such ideas in a non-revolutionary era? Aha, we get to the meat of this. Kortz and the problem of philosophy. Karl Kortz, Lukács' contemporary in Third International, whose work McNair deliberately and explicitly puts aside, offers a pithy formulation in his 1923 essay, Marxism and Philosophy, that a problem which supersedes present relations may have been formulated into an anterior epoch, that is, we may live under the shadow of a problem that goes beyond us. Yes. This is a non-linear, non-progressive, and recursive view of history. Yes. Which, of course, gleaned from Luxemburg and Lenin's contributions to the revisionist dispute in the Second International, Reform, Revolution, What is to be done, Trotsky's results and prospects. It has its origins in Marx and Engels' view of capitalism as a regressive, disintegrative process. Yes. Finally, we get the link that makes this work. It's right here. All right. The view has two registers: self-contradiction and crisis of bourgeois social relations and the transfer and transition to capitalism after the Industrial Revolution, and the disintegrative and self-destructive process of reproduction of capitalism itself, which takes place within and as a function of the reproduction of bourgeois social relations through successive crises. Marx and Engels recognized the crisis of capitalism was motivated by the reproduction of bourgeois social relations on the conditions of disintegrative value of labor and the Industrial Revolution, producing the need for socialism. Yes. The industrial era working class struggle for the social value of its labor was once again regressive, as if bourgeois social relations of the value of labor had not been undermined by the Industrial Revolution, and pointed beyond capitalism, and that the realization of demands of the proper social value of labor would actually mean overcoming labor as a value in society. Yes. 100% Chris, back on board. Transforming the work from life's prime need to life's prime want, work should be done not out of social compulsion to labor in its valorization process of capital, but whether of intrinsic desire and interest, and society won't provide for each according to his own need, from each according to his own ability. As Adorno, a later follower of Lukács and Kortz's work circa 1923, had converted him to Marxism, put it, getting beyond capitalism would mean the overcoming of the law of labor. Yes, I agree. Course's argument in his 1923 essay, Marxism and Philosophy, was focused on this very specific problem, the status of philosophy and Marxism, in the direct sense of Marx and Engels being followers of Hegel, and Hegel representing a certain end to philosophy in which the world would become philosophical and philosophy become worldly. Hegel announced that with his work, philosophy was completed as a function of recognizing how society had become philosophical, mediated through conceptual theory in a ways previously not the case. Marx and Engels accepted Hegel's conclusion, although not its reasoning. They just accepted the conclusion. This is Varn talking. Because why Hegel thought this is very different than why Marx and Engels thought this. In which the case of the issue was for the revolution of bourgeois society, the philosophical world demanded worldly philosophy. The disputes among the Hegelians in the 1830s and 40s were concerned properly with precisely the politics of the bourgeois world and its direction for change. The problem, according to Korsch, was that after the failure of the revolutions of 1848, there was a recrudescence of philosophy, and that this was something other than that had been practiced either traditionally by the ancients or in modernity by revolutionary bourgeois thinkers of the revolution of the bourgeois era, such as Kant and Hegel and Rousseau and John Locke and Adam Smith, etc. at all. What constitutes philosophical questions? Traditionally, this was concerned with three kinds of questions: ontology, what we are; epistemology, what we know; and the good life, how we ought to live. And they were all related. Ontology, epistemology, and ethics were all tied together for Plato and Aristotle and the Socratics and the post-Socratics and the middle Platonist and the late Platonist and early Christian and Islamic philosophy and. All right. Starting with Kant, so traditional philosophical first questions, prima philosophia, our first philosophy, were no longer asked. Or if they were asked, they were strictly subordinated or rendered secondary to the question of the relation of theory and practice, or how to account to ourselves what we are doing. Marxism is not a philosophy in the traditional sense, any more than Kant and Hegel's philosophy was traditional. They're more traditional than Marxism is, bro. But yes. Lenin, in his conclusion on materialism and imperial criticism in 1908, summed up the late 19th century neo-Kantians, started with Kant and leaving him proceeded not forwards towards Marxist materialism, but in the opposite direction, backwards towards Hume and Berkeley. Yes, neo-Kantianism does do this. It does a lot of other gross things too, but we'll stop with that. It is not along the lines of traditional materialist ontology, the first believe that we are material beings. Epistemically, we know the world. Empirically, through our bodily senses, and ethically, we must serve the needs of our true material bodily nature. No, for Kant and his followers, including Hegel and Marx, rather consciously reflect upon the ongoing process from within its moment. We don't step back from what we are doing and try to establish first the basis for asking our questions. Those questions arise rather from our ongoing practices and their transformation. I don't know that that's actually true for Hegel. I'm going to need you to prove that, because Hegel starts with an absolute starting point that is not material at all. Not remotely. Anyway. Empirical facts cannot be considered primary if they are to be changed. Yeah, but they're still important, Chris. Jesus. The theory must go beyond the facts by influencing their transformation and practice. Yes, but they can't remove the limits of the material world on that, because then they removes contemplation from any ability to be practiced. So there is a dialectical tension even in this, that no, empiricism is never going to be good enough. Empiricism actually ignores how the norms of description emerge and are used. But we can't simply say that all these people linked together in German idealism are doing the same thing. Marx is pretty explicit, and I've read the whole sections in our my interlocutors with Chris here about that. Anyway, that said, the form of dialectics is the Hegelian form, and that is what Marx is operating under, so we can't throw it out either. And to be completely non-Hegelian, or to try to wrestle Marx away from the shadow of Hegel, and thus also wrestle Lenin and Luxemburg and Trotsky and whoever else you want to throw into the lineage recitation needed here, peace be upon them, will get you stuck pretty quickly if you don't realize that, you can't just go off empiricism, but you also can't use theory to bracket out the possibility of praxis. Society is our source of our practices and their transformation. I mean, that's such a broad statement as to be a truism, since none of that's defined, and hence our theoretical consciousness of them, aka totality, I guess. Society, according to Rousseau, is the source of our ability to act contrary to our first nature, to behave in unnatural ways. This is our freedom. Sure. Although, these are ideal categories. And for Kant and his followers, our highest moral duty in the era process of enlightenment was to serve the cause of freedom. This meant serving the revolution of bourgeois emancipation from traditional civilization, changing society, although within pretty strong limits, as Kant lays down. However, Kant considered the full achievement of bourgeois society to be the mere midpoint of development of freedom. Hegel and Marxism inherited and assumed the projected perspective on the transitional character of bourgeois society. But they disagreed on what that transitional character was, Chris. Marx and Engels can be considered to have initiated a second enlightenment in the 19th century to the degree to which capitalism presented new problems unknown to the pre-industrial bourgeois era, or made problems in the pre-industrial bourgeois era more obvious since they were already emergent. And that's part of the point of Das Kapital, is it's not just the machines. It's the nature of trade itself and the accumulation of capital, primarily in the forms of land and the production of land commodities such as, I don't know, agriculture. How many yards of linen is first about cotton or whatever you're growing? Because they had not yet arisen in practice. By contrast, philosophers who continued to ask such traditional questions of ontology, epistemology, and ethics were actually addressing the problems of relations of theory and practice in the capitalist era, whether they recognized it or not. Assuming the traditional basis for philosophical questions in the era of capitalism obscured the real issue and rendered philosophy ideological, this is why philosophy needed to be abolished. The question was how. The recrudescence of philosophy in the late 19th century was, according to Cohost, the system of the failure of socialism in 1848, but as such expressed a greater genuine need. The necessity of relating theory and practice is the problem of consciousness under conditions of capitalism, aka, in Lenin's terms, aligning the objective and subjective conditions. Anyway, in this respect, Marxism was sustaining the Kantian Hegelian critical philosophy under changed conditions from the bourgeois revolutionary era from that of capitalism. Yeah, but also with more fucking knowledge and with different metaphysical assumptions. I did notice you bracketed out metaphysics as a category of philosophy because it was, the other major one, maybe the most important one for pre-modern philosophy, because it was a justification of epistemology, ontology, and ethics. It's hard to understand ancient Stoicism without understanding their metaphysics and theology and literal belief in a physical God. That's true for Hobbes too. Anyway, Cohost analogized this recrudescence to the state of post-1948 Bonapartism, which contradicted the bourgeois revolutionary liberal prognosis of the subordination of the state to civil society, and thus the state's withering away. The functions absorbed into free social relations. This meant recognizing the need to overcome recrudescent philosophy as analogous to the need to overcome the capitalist state, the transformation of its necessity through socialism. Bonapartism and philosophy thus expressed a new, late-founded need in capitalism to free society. We look to philosophers to do our thinking for us the same way we look to authoritarian leaders politically. Yes, I 100% agree with this. This is a real problem. My disagreements with this clear lineage argument actually is obscuring the fact that the basic argument I agree with. As Cohost put it, the only way to abolish philosophy would be to realize it. Socialism would be the attainment of the philosophical world promised by bourgeois emancipation, but betrayed by capitalism, which renders society, our social practices, opaque. Is it betrayed by capitalism? Anyway, we'll get back. This is a whole thing about bourgeois society versus capitalism, which, again, go back. Capitalism is not a word Marx uses very much, if at all. particularly in German. It would be premature to say under capitalism everyone was already a philosopher. Indeed, the point is that none are. But this is because of the alienation and reification of bourgeois social relations in capitalism, which renders the Hegelian, Kantian worldly philosophy of critical relations to theory and practice and aspiration rather than an actuality. Yes. Nonetheless, Marxist critical theory accepted such a task as modern critical philosophy, specifically regarding the ideological problem of theory and the practice in the struggle for socialism. This is what it meant to say, as was formulated in the Second International, that the workers' movement for socialism was the inheritor of German idealism. The inheritor, but not the same as. It was the inheritor of the revolutionary process of bourgeois emancipation, which bourgeoisie, compromised by capitalism, had abandoned. The task remained. I mean, which bourgeoisie, which produced capitalism necessarily, had no choice but to abandon because it was inherently self-contradictory in the first place. It wasn't just like the bourgeoisie willed it the wrong way. And this is an ambiguity in the way Chris Cutrone talks about this. There's like both an agency and a lack of agency in a lot of this stuff. I often agree with a lot of the broad statements he's making here, but some of the specifics or the way he's breaking down these categories, I'm not sure totally holds. And I point out that he asserts it a lot and backs it up sometimes. All right. Lenin, Luxemburg, and Trotsky, Orthodox Marxists of the Second International, who radicalized their perspective in the crisis of the Second International and of Marxism in the World War and Revolution in 1914 and 1919, were followed by Lukács and Cohost, who were the subjects of the historical movement in which the crisis of bourgeois society and capitalism was expressed by the social and political crisis in the moment for pre-proletarian socialist revolution, beginning after the Industrial Revolution in the 1830s and 1840s. The attempt to revolutionize society, certainly by wage labor as such, a movement dominated from 1889 to 1914 by the practical politics, as well as the theoretical consciousness of Marxism. Ugh. Whoa. That's a sentence. Why would Lukács and Cohost in the 20th century return to the origins of Marxism and Hegelianism and what Cohost called the consciousness of the revolt of the third state, a process of 17th and 18th centuries that had already begun earlier? Precisely because Lukács and Cohost sought to address Marxism's relation to the revolt of the third estate's bourgeois glorification of the social relations of labor and the relations of this to the democratic revolution. See the example of Abbe Salesse's revolutionary 1789 pamphlet, What is the Third Estate? And this is where Chris is really strong, is in the relationship of Marxism to pre-Marxist radicalism. I want to give Chris this. He's documented it well. And this actually does make sense that Marxism emerges out of what we might call bourgeois liberalism. It is separate from it, but it emerges straight from it. Anyway, how Marxism recognized the relation between labor and democracy continued in 19th century socialism, however, problematically. In Lukács and Cohost's view, proletarian socialism sustained just the bourgeois revolution, albeit under the changed conditions of the Industrial Revolution and capitalist aftermath. Matt Magnier acknowledges this in his focus on the English Enlightenment's materialist empiricism of John Locke in the 17th and 18th centuries, and on the British Chartists of the 19th centuries, their intrinsic continuity in the democratic revolution and Marx and Engels' continuity with both. But then Magnier takes Kant and Hegel, and thus Lukács and Cohost following them, to be counter-Enlightenment and anti-democratic thinkers accommodating autocratic political authority. Yeah, I don't think that's true. I'm going to agree with Chris there. I think in Hegel, it's more ambivalent, but we can get to that. Drawing from Hume's alleged turn away from the radicalism of Locke, back to Hobbes' political conservatism. I mean, I think that's actually true for Hume. And Kant, generally by Rousseau, of whom Hegel remarked that freedom dawned in the world in his works, and who critiqued and departed from Hobbes' naturalistic society, a war of all against all, and built rather upon Locke's contrary view of society and politics, sustaining and promoting the revolution in bourgeois society as more than the sum of its parts, revolutionary in its social relations per se, seminal for the American and French revolutions of the later 18th century. Capital emerging in the 19th century in the Marxist view as a continued social compulsion to wage labor after its crisis in value in the Industrial Revolution, both is and is not the Rousseauian general will of capitalist society. It is self-contradictory mode of production and a set of social relations expressed through self-contradictory consciousness and theory and practice, Of all its social and political subjects, first and foremost, the consciousness of the proletariat. It is the self-contradictory both objectively and subjectively, both in theory and in practice. Yes, but in which way is it self-contradictory? Again, we need to go into specifics. Anyway, I agree with that. It needs to be more specific. Often, as I'm going to say this over and over again when I read Chris's work. Marx and Engels' point was to encourage and advance proletarian's critical conception of the self-contradictory character of its struggle for socialism, which Marx called the logical extreme of the role of the proletariat in the democratic revolution in the 19th century, which could not, according to Marx, takes its poetry from the 17th and 18th centuries, as clearly expressed in the failure of the revolutions of 1848. Marx is famous for formulation of the need for revolution and permanence revolution. That is where it comes from. It is not made up by Trotsky. What this means is that the democratic revolutionary aspirations of the wage laborers for the social republic was the self-contradictory demand for the realization of the social value of labor after it had already taken the form of accumulated capital, what Marx called the general intellect. I don't know that you can say that accumulated capital is what Marx called the general intellect, Chris. I'm going to need more of a footnote there with actual citations that links the two concepts. It is not the social value of labor, but whether this general social intellect, which must be reappropriated, and by the wage laborers themselves and their discontents with the subject of democracy. Sure. This ongoing democratic revolution renders both possible and superfluous in that it renders the state both the agency and the obstacle to its reappropriations. Absolutely. This is the problem that we are still in its post-1848 Bonapartism, which promises everything to everyone to solve the social question of capitalism, but provides nothing, a diversion of the democratic revolution under the conditions of self-contradictory bourgeois social relations. Yeah, although that makes some of the stuff around the Bonapartism of our current executives, both parties, a little bit weirder when reading this from Chris in 2014. Anyway, the state promises employment but gives unemployment benefits and subsidizes the lost value of wages, such as Adorno put it. The workers get a cut of the profits of capital to prevent revolution. Yeah, that's what the welfare state does, peeps, if you don't realize that. Although I'm not sure that not having the welfare state would have promised revolution. That's not given either. Or as Adorno's colleague, the director of the Frankfurt Institute, Max Horkheimer, put it, the Industrial Revolution and its continued social ramifications made not labor, but the workers superfluous. This created a very dangerous political situation, clearly expressed by the catastrophic events of the 20th century, mediated by mass democratic movements. Yeah, sometimes mass democratic movements. But really in the early 20th century, Chris is right. In the 20th century, under the pressure of mass democracy and it's the result of the class struggle of the workers, the role of the state as a self-contradictory and helpless manager of capitalism came to full fruition, but not through the self-conscious activity of the working class political struggle for socialism, confronting a need to overcome the role of the state, but more obscurely with perverse results. 100% agree, Chris. Back on side with you here fully. Still don't know what this has to do with history and class consciousness beyond the few vague points you've made, but I agree here with this outline. Lenin's point of State and Revolution, 1917, was the need for revolutionary transformation of society beyond bourgeois right that is systemically expressed, but according to Lenin, this could be accomplished only on the basis of capitalism itself. See Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder, 1920. If the working class, among the others in bourgeois society, has succumbed to what Lukács called reification of bourgeois social relations, then this has been completely naturalized and can no longer be called out and recognized as such. For Lukács, reification referred to the hypostatization, thank you for making that clear, and conservation of the workers' own politics and projecting their class interest, what Lenin called more trade union consciousness, including that of the nationalist competition, in capitalism rather than rising to the need to overcome this in practice, recognizing how workers' political struggles might point out beyond and transcend themselves. This included democracy, which would occult the social process of capitalism as much as reveal it. Again, can't reconcile this with some of the seeming statements of Chris today, but I think this is brilliant. Thumbs up. I have notes, but not a time. One phenomenon. We got random picture. All right. One phenomenon of such reification in what Adorno called the veil of technology included the appearance of capitalism as such, as in capitalist goods or techniques of organizing production, rather than as Marxism recognized it, a social relation, however self-contradictory. There's a random film still of Hannah Arendt, directed by Marguerite von Trotter here. The anti-Marxist liberal, yet not quite conservative, Heideggerian political theorist Hannah Arendt, and the antagonist of Adorno and other Marxist critical theorists of the Frankfurt School, who was, however, married to the former communist of Rosa Luxemburg's Spartacist League of 1919, expressed well how the working class in the 20th century developed after the failure of Marxism. I hate to give Hannah Arendt credit for anything, but this is pretty accurate. The modern age has carried with it a theoretical glorification of labor and has resulted in the actual transformation of the whole society into a labor society. The fulfillment of the wish, therefore, like the fulfillment of wishes in fairy tales, comes at a moment when it can only be self-defeating. It is a society of laborers, which is about to be liberated from the fetters of labor by technical automation, and the society does no longer know those of other higher and more meaningful activities for the sake of which freedom would deserve to be won. Within the society, which is egalitarian because of its labor's way of making men live together, there is no class left, no aristocracy of either political or spiritual nature from which the restoration of other capacities have been conferred anew. Even presidents, kings, and prime ministers think of their offices in terms of a job necessary for the life of society, and among intellectuals, only solitary individuals are left who consider what they are doing in terms of work and not in terms of making a living. What we are confronted with the prospect of a society of laborers without labor, that is, without the only activity left to them. Surely nothing could be worse. Bing, 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 bing. Hannah Arendt's occasionally white about things. All right. This was written contemporaneously when the Keynesian economic Joan Robinson's statement that the misery of being exploited by capitalists is nothing compared to the misery of not being exploited at all. Yeah, I quote that by Robinson all the time. Robinson, who once accused a Marxist that I have Marx in my bones and you have him in your mouth, compared this to what Heidegger offered to the Nazi-era lectures in Overcoming Metaphysics, that the still hidden truth of being is within the metaphysical humanity. The laboring animal is left to the giddy whirl of its products so that it may tear itself to pieces and annihilate itself in empty nothingness. Yeah, this is why Heideggerianism has an appeal, because it actually does pick up on this. And this is why people try to conflate Heidegger and Marx, which you should never fucking do. But anyway, in The End of Philosophy and the Task of Thinking, 1964, the place of Marx in this process with the reversal of the metaphysics which had already been accomplished by Karl Marx, the most extreme possibility of philosophy is attained. But this was Heidegger blaming Marxism and the metaphysics of labor championed by the bourgeois revolt of the Third Estate and inherited by the workers' movement for socialism without recognizing, as Marx did, the self-contradictory character in capitalism. Ha-ha! I agree with Chris here. Heidegger, for whom the only God we can still save us, meaning the only discovery of new value to serve, and Arendt following him, demonized technologicalized society as a dead end of Western metaphysics, allegedly going back to the Socratic turn of science followed by Plato and Aristotle in classical antiquity. Rather than by recognizing it as a symptom of the need to transform society, capitalism and its need for socialism as a transitional condition of history emerging specifically in the 19th century. This was the resulting flat contradiction that replaced the prior dialectical contradiction of proletarian socialism recognized by Marxism, whose theoretical recovery in the context of the crisis of Marxism and the movement in the Second and Third International has been attempted by Lukács in course. What Arendt called merely objective human conditions, the via activa and the perverse nihilistic destiny of modern society was, once, the subjective dialectical self-contradictory standpoint of the proletariat Marxism. As class consciousness of history, the historical need for the proletariat to overcome and abolish itself as a class. This is why I thought Gilles Devey and Chris Cutrone were kind of actually in line with each other. Something that I need to talk more about sometime. Maybe I'll cover Insurrections Die and how I actually tied this to this essay. Because I did. I actually cited it. And a conference I went to, when was it? Well, I don't think I cited it in this, actually. I cited a different essay by Chris because I couldn't have cited it. But I did cite Insurrections Die before it was even published in notes. At this conference from 2013 with Marxism. It's a Marxism conference that I attended before I left Korea. Anyway. Around the time that I left Platypus. So I must have got this from a different article by Chris. Anyway, the resulting that flat contradiction had replaced the prior dialectical contradiction of proletarian socialism, recognized by Marxism, whose theoretical recovery in the context of the crisis of Marxism and the movement of the Second and Third Internationals have been attempted by Lukács and Cohost. What are merely called the objective human... I've already read this. Via Activa and its first nihilistic destiny modern society was for once a dialectical self-contradictory standpoint of proletariat Marxism as class conscious history. The historical need for the proletariat to overcome itself as a class, including its own standpoint of consciousness, its regressive bourgeois demand to reappropriate the value of labor and capitalism, which would be both realized and negate the bourgeois rights of the value of labor in society. Socialism was recognized by Marxism as raising and advancing the self-contradiction of capitalism to the next stage, motivated by the necessity and possibility for communism. What Arendt could only apprehend as a bail for Teleos, the society of labor becoming itself, Marxism wants to recognize as a need for revolution to advance the contradiction in socialism. This is a good exegesis. I'm not sure what specifically this has to do with Lukács's history and class consciousness in specific, given what was debated between Chris and Lawrence Parker and James Turley and Mike McNair, but I agree with most of this. Hell, I think McNair would agree with a lot of this. When Marxists such as Adorno and Lukács can only sound to us like our inner Heidegger, this is because we no longer live in the revolution. And notice there's always the revolution. Only one. Adorno, that's a platypus thing. Adorno, quote, according to Marxist theory, history is a history of class struggles, but the concept of class is bound up with the emergence of the proletariat. If all the oppression that man has ever inflicted upon man culminates in the cold inhumanity of free wage labor, then the anarchic silence of the pyramids and ruins becomes consciousness of the materialist thought. It is the echo of the factory noise in the landscape of the immutable. This means, however, that dehumanization is also its opposite. In reified human beings, reification finds its outer limits. Only when the victims completely assume the features of the ruling civilization will they be capable of wrestling from the dominant power, even if that dynamic was always the same. Today is not the end. The end today is not the end. Lukács. As Hegel said, directly before the emergence of something quantitatively new, the old state of affairs gathers itself into its original, purely general essence, into its simple totality, transcending and absorbing back into itself all those marked differences and particularities which it evinced when it was still viable. In the age of the dissolution of capitalism, the fetishistic categories collapse and thus become necessary to have recourse to the natural forms underlying them. As the antagonism becomes more acute, two possibilities open up for the proletariat. It gives the opportunity to substitute its own positive contents for emptied and bursting husks, but also exposed to the danger for a time, at least it might itself ideologically to confront these, the emptiest and most decadent forms of bourgeois culture. Why still philosophy? The problem today that we have not faced, as Lukács and Cohost were, with the self-contradiction of the proletarian struggle for socialism and the political problem of the reified forms of the working class substituting for the bourgeois society in its decadence. We replayed the revolt of the third estate and its demands for the social value of labor. We do not have the occasion to recognize what Lukács regarded as the emptiness of bourgeois social relations of labor, its value evacuated by its technical and not political transcendence. We have lost sight of the problem of reification as Lukács meant it. As Hegel scholar Robert Pimpin has concluded in the formulation that is eminently agreeable to Cohost's perspective in the continuation of philosophy as a symptom of a failed transformation of society. In an essay addressing how, by contrast, the original left Hegelian's Marxist Frankfurt School tradition, today, the problem with contemporary critical theory has become insufficiently critical. Perhaps philosophically exists to remind us that we haven't gotten anywhere. The question in the proper role of critical theory and the philosophical questions in politics, in the absence of Marxism, others called to address this. For instance, Arendt, or worse, see Carl Schmitt. Yeah, Carl Schmitt comes up more and more. The sign of degeneration, folks. I agree with Chris on that. Recognizing the potential political abuse of philosophy does not mean, however, we must agree with Heidegger that philosophy will not be able to bring about the direct change of the present state of the world. Their Spiegel interview. Especially since Marxism not only a history of a form of politics, but also, as Hegel and the Frankfurt School scholar Gillian Rose point out, a mode of cognition sui generis. This is because in the late 19th century, the sociologist Emil Durkheim put it, bourgeois society is an object of cognition sui generis. Furthermore, capitalism is a product of social transformation sui generis, one with which we might still struggle, at least hopefully. Marxism is hence the mode of production sui generis, one whose memory has become very obscure. Marxism is hence a mode of politics sui generis, one whose historical memory has become very obscure. This is, above all, a practical problem, but also registers as a philosophically in theory. Yes, I don't agree with all the fine hairs of the theory that Chris is presenting, but I think this is pretty accurate. The problem with what Rousseau called the reflective, and Kant and Hegel, and after Rousseau called the speculative relation of theory and practice in bourgeois society's crisis in capitalism, recognized once by historical Marxism as a critical consciousness of proletarian socialism and self-contradiction, has not gone away but only been driven underground. The revolution originating in bourgeois society in the 17th and 18th centuries that gave way to modern philosophy of freedom and the Rousseauian Enlightenment and German idealism, and that advanced to the new problems in the Industrial Revolution and the proletarianization of society, perverting bourgeois social life into a form of social domination rather than emancipation, and expressed through the Bonaparte state's perversion of democracy, was recognized by Marxism in the 19th century but failed in the 20th century, and may still task us. This is why we might still be reading Lukács. For all my points on fine points that I think are distinctively part of Platypus, that are a little different from what we normally consider Marxism, which I think are valid readings of Marx. I'm not saying that Chris is just making this shit up. I'm saying I disagree with some of these parsings. The broad strokes of this are correct, and it is why I would never throw any Marxist out of the canon, including ones I don't like. No, it's too much to waste your life reading books that are bad, but one does have to read certain things symptomatically no matter what. And so we should still engage with Althusser, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm sympathetic to some of the problems of Althusser and some of the problems of Lukács. I don't think it's just Stalinization or capitulation to reality that was a problem. My position is probably closer to Lawrence Parker ultimately, although I do agree with certain problems of certain interpretations of Lukács, which lead to theoretical overkill, to use Mike McNair's phrase, and to freezing things. I don't know that Chris totally removes that here, but he does break down the ways in which Chris's view of what classical Marxism is expressed in Lukács. And I agree with about 90% of what Chris says classical Marxism is. Whether it's sufficient, even Chris doesn't totally know and has said as much, but we'd have to go into that in deeper conversation. So this doesn't so much function as a critique of Chris Cutrone. I think he's mostly right here. But I'm not sure that it answers all the questions that came up in the prior debates that led to this symposium. Go and read the rest of it. I would also read anything else in the footnotes and listen to my discussion about this with Doug Lane from 4 years ago, where I'm sure I said naive and stupid things. I was moving on to militancy, the highest form of alienation. And Nicolas Villareal's piece in Cosmonaut magazine on materialism. And then maybe we'll get to When Insurrections Die in the next couple of months. I will be changing, and I'm going to make a whole video post about this. I'm going to be changing what we do here, broadly speaking, slowing down these discussions. I'm going to try to stick things I can do in 1 or 2 sittings and not 16. And I'm not going to be doing these monologues 4 days of the week. There will be posts on Monday, Wednesday, and sometimes Friday. When I have guests on other shows, it's often on Wednesday or Friday, so nothing will go that week, so that might move to Friday. And so we don't have multiple things coming on the channel on the same day. And I can't produce stuff for 5 days of the week, plus the additional stuff for the Patreon. I'm burning out, and I need to write a book that I've completed 5 chapters on and rethought the whole premise of, and completing those 5 chapters and thrown the chapters out and started 2 new essays. The process of me book writing is ugly, which is why I don't do it very often. It's why I normally stick to poetry. Anyway, so I hope you've learned a lot from this. Go back and read as much Lukács as you can. Listen to my episodes on him. There are plenty. And take this as a more charitable engagement with Cutrone. I have my specific issues, as came up a lot today in this. But I think this is really pretty good. I would have more issues with almost any Marxist thinker. I do think the flattening of bourgeois society as something separate from capitalism, as somehow capitalism emerged and betrayed it, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that's what Chris is saying either, and I'm not sure the purpose of this distinction. It's not as clear in Marx, and this is a primary distinction that we go back and forth on. Anyway, I'm going to be doing those other essays for a while, and I will maybe be inviting Chris on to the show in the fall if he wants to come on to talk about this and clarify what he means. Lo and behold, he gets plenty of things over there on Sublation, and there's shit Platypus Says podcast. There's a lot of stuff to find what the Platypus Affiliated Society and Chris Cutrone think. But maybe it would be worth deeper engagement with me, his botched pupil. All right. Take care. And engage critically between each other, too. Not stifle debate. And keep your peace.